Hello everyone, I'm Byron. So today's video is inspired by a conversation I had with a client recently. So the client was complaining about how people from a certain tribe usually have easy access to loan when they go to the banks. So the argument was that when people from the Kikuyu tribe, when they go to a bank, that they have better chances of accessing a loan, and they also have higher amount. They're given higher amounts of loans as compared to people from other tribes. So of course I knew this isn't true, but it really got me thinking, why really are some regions in Kenya more developed than other areas, and especially regions that are occupied by the Kikuyu communities. So that's why I'm making this video today, not only for the client but also for your sake, so that you can understand why there's a lot of differences in terms of the wealth and in terms of the value of property and in terms of development when it comes to regional differences in Kenya. Let's dive right in. So Kenyan communities are basically made up of the Bantus, the Kushites and the Nilotes. Bantus mostly are they come from the West Africa. The Kikuyus, the Luyas, they come from the Congo Basin. Then you see that the patterns of movements is that they came from that region and they settled, the Kikuyu settled in the Mount Kenya. And because of the fertile land and because of the reliable rainfall in the area, they also settled there because of there's a lot of forests, and they preferred that kind of environment. We also have the Luyas who settled in the western region because of the fertile lands, because of the high rainfalls, and this was going to be favorable for their mixed kind of farming, where they have both livestock and they also grow crops. So the Kambas settled in semi-arid areas such as the eastern parts of Kenya, because these areas were their trade routes because of the location in between Nairobi and Mombasa. The Merus finally, they settled also in the central part of Kenya because they preferred the fertile land that is in the region. So we have the Nilotes, where we just talk about the Luos and the Kalenjin. So secondly, we have the Nilotes, which is made up of the Luos, the Kalenjin, the Maasais, and other minor communities which we are not going to get into. So each community settles where land matches their way of life and their economic activities. This is where we start to have the differences in land values, because people are practicing different economic activities within the same country, and therefore you find that because of this, land is going to greatly have a difference in terms of value based on the location that you are in. So before colonization, we see that these people of this community lived in a manner where there was no central leadership. People who basically just behaved well, people who were of good morals, people who were termed by society to have good standards, they were assigned to be leaders, but there was no total leadership where one could claim to be the leader of an entire group, but rather they had, for lack of better terms, they had smaller leaders that were just appointed by the people. So these leaders were in charge of councils of elders that were referred to, I think in the Kikuyu community they are called kiamas. So these leaders were in charge of these small kiamas, which are basically just councils, and these councils would help these people to make decisions. So because of the large tracts of land that existed and the low population, this was really favorable for the kind of living that these people adopted at the time. Basically, they will go out and clear bushes and forests and claim that as their family land. Boundaries will be marked by either the pre-existing rivers, and the people themselves will either fence the land by growing trees or by having just some shrubs along what they claimed as the boundaries. So this land was not to be sold out, it was to be passed on from the father to the grandchild, and so on and so forth. So just like any other tribes in Kenya, traditionally we all know that ladies did not have that much say when it comes to matters land. They will be married off, and therefore men will be left to the land. So they had a stronger voice, a stronger say when it comes to inheritance from their fathers. So land was very sacred, and it was considered to be something very spiritual. and that is why you'll find that they settled near the mountain. This made them feel closer to their god, and they will want to maybe have places that are nearer to forests, because there are certain beliefs that they have that certain trees bring them closer to God, and you'll find that these trees are located near the mountain, and so they prefer to be closer to the mountain because of this aspect. It also made it easier for them because their elders would get easy access to these areas to do their rituals, to cleanse the societies, to cleanse in case there is someone who needed some kind of cleansing. They will be easy because some of the cleansing will require them to go to mountains, and therefore it was easier for these elders to just easily access the mountains and do the rituals and the cleansing of the people, because even the disputes were considered to be things that had to be sorted out through rituals and such kinds of traditional cleansing. So the way that they settled is that you'll find people scattered. They were not grouped into one place, but rather if they occupied an entire region, for instance, if they occupied maybe say Ruiru, you'll find one person living in this place and then the next person living some kilometers away, and that's how they were basically. They were settled and there was a lot of land, and so people would live this way so that they had a lot of land to practice agriculture, and also they just needed some kind of peace, and therefore they preferred to isolate themselves in small groups, and the rest was either set aside for grazing or for farming. So much later on, the British started to visit Africa. Some of the reasons that the British came to Kenya is because they wanted to completely control the trading that was happening in the region. They did not want the other European countries and the Indians and the Arabs to overtake them, and therefore they wanted to ascertain their dominance, and so they declared Kenya to be a British protectorate. Then some of them came as missionaries who had come earlier. Some of them also came because of the construction of the railway from Indian Ocean to Uganda. Nairobi was plain and it was very level, therefore very favorable for settlement, and that's why they made it to be the port for the Kenya-Ugandan railway. We see that even by virtue of Nairobi being selected as the port for railway line, we see that the Kikuyus already have an advantage. The Kikuyus already have an advantage because all around Nairobi, you see that a majority of the land is basically just Kikuyu land to the north of Nairobi and to the west of Nairobi, and therefore you see that even though at that time it was unfair for them because they had to be pushed away and they had to be turned into settlers, but right now they are enjoying because of that fact. And so because of these activities, and so by virtue of them choosing Nairobi, you see they have already placed the Kikuyu land, part of Kikuyu land, and as an advantaged area, because Nairobi is almost entirely surrounded by Kikuyu land, especially the north and in the west. During this time that we were under the British colony, we see that the British people would choose land that was very fertile for the sake of economic agriculture, for the sake of growing cash crops, and so they chose the highlands such as the Rift Valley, but mostly they went for the central areas where they chose these regions, and they grew coffee, they grew tea, they grew pyrethrum and other cash crops. And so you'll find that the people who initially owned large tracts of land are now becoming settlers, and most of them have been made to be laborers. So instead of going all the way to say Kisumu or all the way to Western, they will just pick people from that region and they will make them to be immediate laborers. So you find that when they pick these people, they need to train them. They need to train them on how to speak English, and this means they are the first people to get the education. They also need to train them because some of them are going to be used to be leaders, to be chief and to be policemen. So they need to train them also on how to use guns and rifles. They need to train them on how to manage economies, on how to manage people, on how to lead, and therefore you find that this has made them to be already advantageous because they're the first people getting the interaction with the British people. So those of them who are educated, they will also be engaged in trading because they traded on behalf of the British people. Because the British did not know the African native languages, they will send these people to go and trade on their behalf. They had now to come back and to reward them, to give them part of the loot, and to maybe to assign better conditions as opposed to the other Africans, other Kenyans who are living within the same settlements. So years later, when now the time has come for the British to go back, when Kenya is finally now getting back its independence, we see that now land has to be distributed back to Africans. The land that the whites initially occupied, it has to be given back to the Africans. And so the settlement schemes are now being given back to friends of the president of the time, basically most of them being Kikuyus, and also you find that the political elites of the time also were grabbing these lands and they were owning them to themselves and giving them to their families. So that is how you find that the very early stages of land distribution happened. So let's just look at what colonialism did to the land ownership in Kenya, and especially for the Kikuyu community, is that initially the land was communal, but now we see that there is a lot of privatization where now people are beginning to privately claim land, that this land now belongs to me as a person, as an individual. Initially, it was for the clan and for the family, where a single person could not sell the parcel of land. Also, the disputes that were being initially solved by the traditional elders that involved a lot of rituals and a lot of cleansing in the mountain, that also is gradually starting to change, because now the British people have left courts, which are more formal way of solving problems, and therefore the people also adapted to these court systems, and the people are now preferring to do things formally as opposed to what happened before the British people came. And so lastly, also on land, that initially land was not to be sold out for outsiders, but you see that after the taking over of the government of Jomo Kenyatta, you see that now people are starting to be more, people are starting now to buy land in these places because of privatization. Now land is privately owned and no longer a communal thing, no longer a communal asset, and people now can cut off their parcels of land and dispose them off to different people, regardless of whether they are from the same community or not. So slowly by slowly, Nairobi began to grow because of the factories that are located within, and so there was a high demand for residential units for the people who are coming to provide the labor in these factories, and therefore we find many people had to relocate either to slums such as Kibera because of the kind of pay they were receiving at that time, and those who could not afford, or those who could not get room into these places, they had to move into places that are nearer to Nairobi, because the alternative was the very expensive places that were occupied by the elites of the time. So you find that there was a lot of the demand for rental property within the neighboring areas to Nairobi started to grow gradually because of this. And also for other towns such as Thika, they also became industrial hubs just like Nairobi, and factories began to be set up in those areas. And so we feel that the concentration also moved away from Nairobi to Thika, and the same happened in Nakuru, and so people also moved away from Nairobi to Nakuru, and so the same trend continued to happen, and so people begin to move into these areas. People begin to prefer these areas as their areas of residency, and you know that at this time most people are renting rather than buying because they have just gotten the independence, and therefore they are just beginning to stabilize. So other than the fact that the location was a really favorable factor for these places and for these lands, the second thing that really favored these people was the politics, because you'll see that because of the first president being from the Kikuyu and the many leaders of that time being also coming from this land, from this tribe, there was so a lot of development was at that time taken to these regions. If you look at the very first factories that were being set up at the time, they came up in Thika, where we had a lot of KTDA factories that were coming up at the time, in Kiambu, in Murang'a, in Nyeri. Also outside of Kikuyu land, we also had maybe Kericho and such places where we still have tea factories that were constructed back then in the 60s, in the 1960s, but they still exist up to now. But a majority of them, they were taken to Kikuyu land. Okay, maybe not necessarily because of the tribal factor, But because these places already had proven that they can grow coffee, they can grow tea, and therefore this trend did not end. The people continue to grow coffee, they continue to grow the cash crops, and so the presidents and the leadership of the time, they just came to set up to innovate on already what was existing. So this is obviously going to open up the economy, because there's a lot of circulation of money within the same area. So you see people growing and taking their tea, their coffee, their pyrethrum, they're taking them to factories which are just within the same locality, and therefore these places are slowly but slowly beginning to experience economic growth, because now there's going to become the need for roads in order for them to transport these things. There's going to become the need for someone to come and repair the tools that they're using. There's going to be need for electricity. There's going to be the need for water to be pumped into these places. And therefore, by these factors alone, you see that these places are already beginning to open up, and they're already beginning to take up a step ahead of other areas in Kenya. So these leaders of the time, they became very wealthy, and therefore they also decided to put back the investment into these areas. So it's basically just money being returned back to the same areas that they're coming from. And so you'll find that most of them who could afford to develop factories and to invest, they put their money back to the areas where they're coming from. They invested in Kikuyu land, enabling many people to get employment. So they are investing back. They're using government monies to invest in this area so that their businesses can thrive, not knowing that eventually they are going to lead to the entire area opening up. So that is how you have Nairobi spilling over to the neighboring areas. You find that institutions are being set up, such as universities being set up in other areas that are not in Nairobi, even in Thika town, and now they are creating some kind of alternative to Nairobi. So people are already seeing that there is no need to go to the main city. They're settling in other smaller towns within the regions of these communities. So the ownership during the colonial period was, we had the Crown land. The Crown land was a land that was purely owned by the British people, and these were the White Highlands, the very prime land in the motherland. They claimed ownership over this land, and they utilized them for their own benefits. We also had native reserves. So the native reserve is what was given to the communities where they will go and settle. The Luya people, the Kikuyu people, the Luo people, the Kisis. That is what they were given to go and to live there with their families. And then we also had the freehold and the private land. And this is during the time of the colonial period. So the freehold and the private land, this is given to now the settlers. It's given to the European settlers. Also given to companies that are coming to set up factories, and it's also given to the missionaries. So that's where mostly you'll find that the Catholics, they got a lot of their land from these kinds of arrangements, because they were being encouraged to go and to keep on preaching, and so they were given a lot of land in the country and a lot of prime land just to be clear. So that's why you find that they're really established in places and they have a lot of land. So by the time the British were leaving Kenya, they had left already a formal system of land registration, where now one could not just claim by word of mouth that you own a piece of land, but rather the land had to be registered. If it is a leasehold parcel, you have to register it as a leasehold, and for how many years. That's why we have the 99 years that most people have today. People are given title deeds, and they were allowed to trade their land. It now became formal, where you could now officially trade land. You could officially take a mortgage, and that's the system that the European people left. So the next president who came in, who is now Mwai, he was more focused on stabilizing the government and gaining a lot of power as a president, and also reigning over a longer period of time, over probably the longest period of time. He achieved this through the one-party system, and his focus was not as much into development as the previous president was, the Jomo Kenyatta. And you'll find that the kind of his investment he made to his people was mostly to appoint them into senior government offices. He appointed them to ministries. He appointed his people to the policing department and to other disciplines such as the KDF and such kinds. And so he appointed a lot of people from his native communities to these institutions. And so you'll find that even though he reigned for a longer period, but the region where he's from is still underdeveloped as compared to the Kikuyu, what we call the Kikuyu land. He also did a lot in terms of education, but this does not really give back to the value of land. So even though he reigned for a very long period, not focusing on development, but you can see that the president who was there before him had already set the ball rolling for the Kikuyu region, and therefore the factories that were already developed at the time, they continue to grow. There was nothing that he could do to stop this growth because it had already initiated, and the factories were already operating very well, and they already Kenya was already very dependent on these factories. You see that the people from this region are already becoming financially stable. They're already growing economically because of what their politics has done to them, because of what the location in terms of the land has also favored them for. So by the time the next president is taking over, who is Mwai Kibaki, that is in around 2003, by the time he's taking over, you see that the region is already set up for growth. So the president of the time was really focused on economic growth and on opening up the country to enable people to just thrive in business. One of the things he did caused equity to be able to move up from being just equity building society, which was a small circle, and became Equity Bank. It was approved by a commercial bank to become now an official bank, and that is what really opened up also, because it led to them sprouting and opening up several branches. It separated the mortgage market from politics, and so the interest rate, they went down, and therefore people were able to access loans, and by virtue of that you find that many people now become able to construct houses, to construct flats. They became able to, because they could access loans, they could now develop their property. So the lands that they had been holding on to for a long time, they now found something they can do with these lands. And so from that time, that's why you begin to see many people began to take loans from banks. They could qualify for loans regardless of their history. They could qualify for loans just because of the value of lands that they had. And because the president of the time did this not to favor his people, but rather to open up the entire country. But because the region that is from, the people there, the value of their land was already high because of the politics and whatever had played out before him. So these people could access more loans because of the land that they have, because of the roads that is in their region, because of the hospitals, because of the institutions, the universities that are in the institutions, and therefore most of their land has been converted from residential to commercial, from residential to industrial, and therefore it is very prime. Some of them even changed from growing tea to building up real estate, and therefore land became very prime, especially in Kiambu and in other Kikuyu regions. Therefore these people could access a lot of money when it comes to loan. Actually, if you compare right now, the value of land in just merely in, let's say, Ruaka, a parcel of, let's say, an acre, will go at something like maybe 15 million. It's still much more, it's almost 10 times more than an entire acre in Bungoma, in Homa Bay, in Oyugis. So even if you were to apply whatever kind of criteria, you see that it is very difficult to compete with this kind of a setup. So it is not that they are favored to the bank in any kind of way, but rather it is because of the value of their land, which is very high. That is number one. It's because of the location that they have. They are in places which have high demand. Like for instance, anywhere near Nairobi, people really want to live in that place so that they can be able to access Nairobi. And so when they build their flats, they are full within a very short time, as compared to you who will build your flat in Kisumu maybe, where there is not a lot of demand for residential property. Maybe you who will build a flat in Bungoma, in Machakos maybe, where there's not so much demand for residential property. So you find that when these people, because of the setup they have, because of the value of the land they have, because of demand for property, for renting, in the places where they own land, so they are more advantaged. And so when they apply for loans from banks, banks also can see that the value of their property is also fairly high. So that's why you see that these places are very much developed as compared to the rest of Kenya, is because of the value of the land there, and the value of land has come as a result of what we've just discussed, which is not just the location as a result of what the colonial people decided to place Nairobi, but also as a result of the politics that came after the colonialists had left. You see that the leadership was almost entirely Kikuyus, and the people also who led them, it was not just about tribalism, but they did a lot of development. They really invested back in their motherland. So the same happened when Uhuru Kenyatta took over. You would feel that he went ahead and expanded completely what Mwai Kibaki had done. He built more roads, and if you go to Kikuyu land right now, you'll find that even in the very rural places where people do not even have vehicles, the roads there, they are very good. And so the road networks, it's very easy now to access the markets. So even for the farmer who is going to be selling milk, he can easily just take his bicycle and ride to the market. The motorbikes can just easily just be ridden around. So it is the access is very convenient because the road is tarmacked even where there are no vehicles. Currently, with the president of this time now, William Ruto, one of his agendas, which is under the bottom-up economic model, we find that is to support small businesses and the informal sector basically. And also this, you'll see it will still touch on them because most businesses are still owned by the same people who can access loans, and so it is even giving them more advantages over the rest of the people. So it is not something that can be changed in a short period of time, but it will take a lot of time for us to catch up, for the rest of us to catch up. Because even the agricultural reforms that it's pushing for, the food security, it will still touch on the people who are investing heavily into agriculture and into food security, where you still find that the majority is the Kikuyu people, followed by the Kalenjins. So the Kikuyus are still favored, regardless of where you place them. They are still on a higher advantage over the rest of Kenyans. So it is not something that anyone can change in any time from now, but it's something that started a long time ago. So even some of the reforms that the current president is undertaking, you'll find that it still places them on a higher advantage as compared to the rest of the Kenyans. However, for the affordable housing, now this is the only threat that comes to pose to most of the landlords within Nairobi and in all the townships in Kenya, because one is required to pay just 5% of the asking price of the house. The houses are going for around 3 million to I think the most expensive one should be something to do with 6.7 million, and that is a 2-bedroom, or I think a 3-bedroom. So the studios and the 1-bedrooms are going for around 3 million to 4 million, where you are required to continue to save gradually. But if you have reached the 5% threshold, then you can go and live in the property. So 5% of 3 million is around 150,000. Once you've attained this, you can move into the house, and then the rest of the money you will be paying as a rent-to-own arrangement, whereby you are paying a rent of about 6,000, and that rent is also part of that it is rent, and at the same time it is you buying off the property. So in the next 10 years to 15 years, if that project is not messed up with the corruption and maybe with stalled project, then people who own flats in Nairobi and within other townships are really going to have a hard time, because many people are going to move into these affordable housing units. They are much more affordable, and there is more facilities in them at very affordable rates. So we've seen that inequalities in terms of the land values that we have in Kenya did not just happen by chance. It's something that came gradually, and it came as a result of many factors playing in. We've also seen that there is no kind of favoritism that they get from bankers, but rather it is because of their land. And I think we've also learned that politics plays an important role. If the leadership is really for development, then you can really change the real estate of even of a community, and can put them at an advantage. So it's something that is possible, but better to have a leader who is going to have national visions, other than to have just visions for their community, because we expect the entire of Kenya to grow as a unit. So thank you for watching. We do real estate advisory. If you have any kind of dispute relating to land, relating to real estate or any kind of property, we also do property valuations. So feel free to like, share, and contact in the information at the bottom of the screen. So thank you and see you in the next video.